welcome to 4020 Not Live. For a start, Cat's may invade because I'm not in the studio, as you can see. But as you can see, I've been replaced by someone much more taller and handsomer than I am. And looking very well, James Child, former match official. You do look well, it has to be said. Unless the RFL just picked bad pictures of you to stick on their website when I, look at your retirements. How are you? Are you missing standing in the middle of a field?
Not in this weather, that's for sure. I'm missing the buzz of refereeing, but not most of the other stuff that went with it. If I'm honest, it was a sort of a way of life, really, rather than a job. And the demands with having a young family now mean that I get to spend my weekend doing any one of a number of things, and we can plan things and book things in and have a social life and all those wonderful things.
I think it's amazing that the 8-point try has been invented since you retired. You used to get one a season if you were lucky. Now we've had, 3 in 2 weeks? It's getting ridiculous.
Yeah, there's obviously been a slight change to the interpretation of that law, I suspect, since I finished at the end of last season. And I suspect that's just, in terms of the process of how it works week to week, is that each week the referees will have a group review, usually on a Tuesday, where they'll look at incidents from across the round and discuss and debate them and come to some conclusion. I can only imagine that the conclusion was, after the Warrington game, that both 8-point tries were considered to be correct. And in law, they were, because ultimately a foul was occurred on the try scorer in the process of scoring a try. And however, the interpretation that we've always applied, or I've always applied, has been that it's generally been major foul play, not just something that simply otherwise would have been a penalty. And they've obviously changed tack now. Whether that's sort of informed by the way that the game's changed in relation to the application and ruling on foul play, I'm not sure. I'm not party to that.
I mean, we all love one of these edicts that happens. I remember, like the start of last season, where everyone was getting sent off and sin binned for head injuries or headshots rather, and then everyone moaned, so everyone stopped being sent off and sin binned. It's always good when these things happen in clusters and then slowly die off. And do we think that's going to happen with the 8-point try, or is that going to be a thing that continues throughout the year?
I think last year was. You've used the word clampdown, I think, in previous podcasts, and it's not a word that we use or ever have used as referees, and it's not one that we would like to use either. Having said that, last year there was a significant change at the start of the year, and then it was changed again probably about a third of the way through the year. And I was probably involved in 2 of those games. One as a referee on the Huddersfield-Castleford game, where we ended up with a number of sin bins. Match review panel decided to back off from charging some of those in the way that they charged earlier. And then the subsequent week, I was video referee for the Wigan Castleford game, and we sin binned, I can't remember the name of the player actually, I think it was a Castleford player for a late hit on a passer, which, the interpretation at that point was, at any point once the ball's left, if there's contact on a passer, it's considered to be late, and that's automatically a sin bin without much interpretation. That was ultimately changed off the back of that decision, because even I was uncomfortable with that decision, recommending a sin bin. So I think we got to a reasonable place last year, and then with the changes that occurred at the end of this season into the start of this season in relation to downgrading some of those offences, and meaning that players are less likely to be suspended and probably will get a fine, for example, I think that's had a positive effect. This change in terms of 8-point try that I can read between the lines has come about through the group review process, whereby they'll have had to decide whether the decisions to give the 8-point tries in the Warrington-Salford game were considered to be ultimately correct. Now, to the letter of the law, they were correct, but you have to decide whether that's the standard. Is that the standard that we are going to apply this season to the awarding of an 8-point try? And I can only suspect that the answer was yes to that, and that's why Chris Kendall then awarded one in the Hull game, because on the face of it, it looked relatively soft. But nevertheless, he tackled him high, and anywhere else on the field, it would have been a penalty. So you can't say it's wrong in law. It just comes around, I guess, the communication of whether an interpretation change has been made.
So we've thrown you in at the deep end. We haven't even properly welcomed you, and we're already asking you to explain.
I asked if he missed it. I asked if he missed refereeing, Phil. Like, that's the easy question.
I feel guilty. That's all.
No.
The other thing I was going to ask, because if I don't ask you now, I'll forget, and then it'll be my fault. Who is responsible when a player is clearly bleeding profusely to get that player off the pitch? Because we've all saw Willie Isa, and I think we would all, applaud his bravery. That must have been incredibly painful, and to play with that going on. But clearly, he had blood all over his face and blood all over his shirt, and he was allowed to play on whilst that was happening. I think the referee spoke to him a couple of times and said, "You're going to have to go off and get this checked." Whose responsibility is it maybe to stop the game, or should it be when the doctor comes on? And I was just thinking, It looked a bit odd.
I didn't think it looked right, if I'm being honest. I thought the game should have been stopped earlier than it was. I think the referees are being encouraged to try and keep the game flowing where there are injuries. And so, there's a green card scenario. So potentially if the game needed to be stopped, then the physio, the doctor could alert the referee to say, can you stop the game? And the game would then be stopped. And at that point, they'd have to make a decision whether that player was going to go off for a head impact assessment, or if they were able to continue playing, because the game's been stopped, they would be issued a green card. Now, for me, I think blood is slightly different, where you see a player bleeding profusely. That's a safety matter for the other players and himself. So for me, the game should have been stopped as soon as you see a player bleeding, and that player should then be given an opportunity to have that injury treated. If it can't be treated, then he should leave the field. So he gets one opportunity. At the second occasion, if he bleeds again, he has to leave the field immediately. The game may be stopped, but he has to leave the field and have that treated. So the first time you had quite a long delay. It was a scrum, I think, wasn't it? They brought on a shirt and that sort of stuff. So that can happen. But I'd be interested to know whether they discussed that as a group, whether there's been any slight change to the application of the green card this year. I know that they were encouraged to try and keep the games flowing as best they can.
We are obviously a pro match officials podcast, so we get enough stick for sticking up for match officials, because obviously you don't knock on and throw forward passes. Obviously you miss a few from time to time, especially against whichever team we happen to support at the time. But what is creeping in, perhaps, and it's been mentioned on commentary by former players, is players cheating, trying to con match officials into getting penalties or whatever. How hard do the players make the job of a match official on a weekly basis?
Yeah, if it wasn't for the players, it'd be easy, wouldn't it? But then we wouldn't have a game. So I think since probably 1895, players and coaches have tried to find ways to bend the rules to suit their own needs, and that's just the game, isn't it? Cheating is probably a strong word. I think we were in a worse place a few years ago where it led to a change in the interpretation of the video referee and his role on foul play, where you were finding that where a referee had probably missed some contact to the head and it only merited a penalty, the players were staying down because they knew the game would be stopped. Video referee would then come in and basically say, yes, it's a penalty, and the penalty was awarded. So that was changed a few years ago. So the video referee can only come in those situations where the offence merits a yellow or red card. And that really, I think, tidied it up to some extent. The more stringent application of the green card, trying to keep the game flowing, has probably helped. I think we've seen less players of trying to slow the game down, and the introduction of the shot clock a few years ago, where dropouts were taking an age, scrums were taking an age. I think that's improved. And I was at the game on Friday where I thought the game did flow. There were very few stoppages in the game, and I think where you're getting injuries, there are genuine injuries, like the Isa incident in the Wigan game. He was clearly injured. I don't think players, spectators, people at home watching on TV mind the game being stopped in those situations.
So when fans say players deliberately stayed down to get an opponent sin bin, that isn't the case?
Well, that may be the case, yeah. That may be the case. Yeah, who can say?
But they have been hit late, so it does deserve looking at.
Yeah, and if you look back at the Wellesby incident, when he ran in on the shoulder charge by Walters, if it hadn't been for Wellesby, the incident probably wouldn't have been seen and play would have continued. So the downside, in my view, by not dealing with Wellesby and his actions is it's almost encouraging those actions. And I'm sure that was fed back to St. Helens as part of the discussion, sort of post-match and post-review, that won't be tolerated. So yeah, there are occasions perhaps where players do recognise that they've been hit illegally and do stay down. But who's to say whether that's legitimate or otherwise? I'm not a doctor, and referees can only deal with what's in front of them.
And the good news is that now Sam Tompkins has announced his retirement. It will boost the ranks of the full-time referee.
Stole that from me. I was going to say that.
It wasn't me. I'm joking. But in terms of players that you enjoyed refereeing and those that made your life a misery, where would Sam rate on a Brian McDermott scale of 2 to 9?
Well, the players that came up to you and sort of swore in your face and had a go at you were easy to deal with because you could penalise it, you could sanction it in some way. Players that came up with a legitimate question done in an appropriate manner is far more challenging for a referee, you know. So I think with somebody like Sam, I think he was more of that kind of person. But actually, probably from a spectator's point of view, you see him coming to the referee quite a bit, and you feel as though he's trying to referee the game when perhaps he's not. I think if you're in a situation like that as a referee, if he's not the captain and you recognise that this same player keeps coming towards you, then you'll probably try and resist that conversation and direct it through the captain because you don't want to be seen to be having the strings pulled. But I wouldn't say, you know, Sam was particularly challenging in that area.
I was only joking.
So we do need coaches now then to say to players, go to referees, but ask difficult questions. Ask difficult questions. Don't swear. Don't be offensive. Just ask difficult questions and make them question what they're doing.
Well, that's what I would do if I was a coach. But, you know, that's what a captain should be doing. He shouldn't be just asking questions for the sake of asking questions. He should be asking a question because he's genuinely not sure what's being given or the interpretation of something, so he can feed that back to his players. So it's not trying to encourage talk for talk's sake. And the referees are not stupid. They'll soon catch on if they feel a player's trying to sort of hoodwink them, slow the game down by having a conversation every person.
And again, we haven't got you here just to talk about refereeing stuff, but while you are here, we can talk about refereeing stuff. Captain's Challenge, is that something you would have welcomed being brought over here, or does that just slow the game down a little bit? Before I'd used it and be part of it during the World Cup and watching it as somebody just watching on TV in the NRL, I felt it went against everything that the game is trying to do by keeping the game flowing. And for me, I think the sole purpose of the Captain's Challenge is to create controversy, to create a talking point, potentially. And I don't think my view really changed significantly in the World Cup. It depends on, you know, they've got a bunker system in the NRL, so it's far more efficient in terms of the time it takes. So the process is much quicker than it was perhaps in the World Cup and would be in Super League. And then obviously you've got an inconsistency in the competition anyway, because you've only got video referees at 2 or 3 games out of the 6 each weekend. So you would immediately have another inconsistency there. So I think from a referee's point of view, it would be great to have it on those occasions where you make a decision and in your heart of hearts you realise you've probably got it wrong, and actually you've got to get out. So you can have a ref challenge.
Challenge yourself. Yeah. And I think you saw that when they first brought it in the NRL, referees were almost sort of saying to the players, well, not because they thought they got it wrong, but almost saying to the players, well, you've got a challenge, use it. And then players backed off them, but they didn't want to use the challenge, so they suddenly went quiet. So, you know, it would have some merit to some degree on those occasions where, admittedly, decisions have been made incorrectly. But overall, for me, it depends what the game's wanting to achieve out of it. Are we wanting to create a talking point? Well, it would do that. Are we wanting to keep the game flowing? Well, it goes against that. So I think that's the crux for the game to decide, notwithstanding the broadcaster's view on it.
I mean, I do enjoy it on the cricket or the NFL where they get it spectacularly wrong. So the referee is proven right, and you'll go, well, you're an idiot, aren't you? But yeah, not that we should call people idiots. You mentioned the video referee system. Is it a frustration how slow sometimes it is to come to a decision, because everyone at home shouts at the telly. Rod Studd loves it. He can't get enough of video referees in any sport. But when you're there actually trying to make a decision, is there a frustration in how slow the process can be sometimes?
I think now people can hear the video referee talking through the decision. I think it makes it easier that people can see the process that's being followed. That, you know, if a try's come from a kick, you've got to go back and check the onside from the kick. So, you know, things like that do slow the process down. Again, in the NRL with the bunker, they would have already checked the onside before it even gets referred. And now with the NRL, they've made the change to basically award a try that's a live decision of a try, and then it automatically gets reviewed. And if the video referee thinks that it needs looking at in more detail, they'll ask the on-field referee to send it up to the bunker. So that, again, reduces the time that's taken to slow the game down, really. So there are systems that you could adopt, but it would potentially mean a review system like the bunker system, and that costs millions of dollars to implement. So again, it comes back to money for me. So I think the system works as well as it probably can work.
Of all the things that we need to talk about over the weekend, I think one of the most interesting, which flew under the radar a bit, was our league live screening the whole Salford game, and the fact that that game had a video referee, which I don't think was used. I can't remember. I didn't see every minute of it. But is that the way do you think we'll go? I mean, it's sort of an open question to everybody that we've called a lot that our league needs to decide what it is and what it should be focusing upon. And it's such a mixture of different games, which is great to see the sport in its entirety. But if you're ever going to sell it, you've got to have premium products, I think. And that seemed to go really well. They're clearly not going to divulge the viewing figures, but to have an extra game, perhaps an electronic season ticket a little bit further down the line, and a video referee at that game, that's got to be a step forward.
Absolutely. That's the way the game's got to go, in my opinion. And ultimately, my view is that that's why our league was created. It was a sort of a fairly medium-term project where you get people on board in terms of numbers. You can almost sell that because you've got X number of hundreds of thousands of people that are signed up as members, etc. But you know, there was a trial many years ago. In fact, I think Ashley Klein was the video referee on a game at OKR, and that's when he was here, and he left in 2008. So that's how long ago we're going back. There was a trial of a non-TV game with a video referee where you only had, I think, maybe 2 cameras in the main stand, which you'd normally have, and then 1 at either end. Now, I don't know how many cameras they had at
it won't have been much more.
Yeah, but I think in fairness, you can run a system with probably 1 at each end and the 2 that you'd have anyway in the main stand. So I think that's the way that the game's got to go, because you create perhaps more consistency by having video referees at each game, because the video referee, remember, is not only used for tries and no tries, it's used for foul play. So you've got the opportunity to review on foul play, which on non-TV games you wouldn't. So yeah, for me, it's absolutely the way to go. I would be interested to know the numbers of people that they got paying for it.
Commercially sensitive.
I'm sure it is. I wouldn't reveal it if I was the RFL. But at £4.95, I wonder who are we targeting? We're targeting the Rugby League audience, aren't we? We're not targeting a new audience. I think that's the other question, isn't it? About
well, that depends where you advertise it, well, because you only advertise it amongst the Rugby League audience.
True.
That's all you get.
But I didn't know, as somebody that follows Rugby League, I didn't even know whether it was just exclusive on our league. That was a little bit of confusion, I thought, about that. So I think it needs to be made clear that it is exclusively on our league.
I think that's where with their digital strategy, which is the one thing I'm absolutely confident when they do roll that out, will be different, make the game look and feel different. I think if they've got that as part of their stable, a game every week that will be released digitally and with probably some degree of marketing behind it, that I think could be a major step forward. It was almost sneaked in this week. And I'm sure a lot of Salford fans who paid $4.95 felt they had great value for money.
Well, just that one try in the second half was worth £4.95, I reckon.
I hope Michael. All I can hope is Michael Shenton got paid a fair whack as a Hull FC employee to have to commentate on that game. That would have been a bit of an interesting situation. I didn't see the game itself, but the price point is interesting, isn't it? And again, $4.95 is neither here nor there. I know it goes up to £10 on the day. But there's plenty of examples elsewhere in sport, and ice hockey is the one I always use. They're charging £15 for a game. and you could have 2 games on a weekend. £15 for a match. So is £4.95 too cheap?
What's interesting is you've got to have that balance between having fans still go to the match and those that sit there and think there's 8 foot of snow on the ground. The M62's a pig. It cost me 25 quid if I got there, plus the diesel and whatever food I might eat. It makes sense to pay £4.95. But I think because it was a whole home game and they've got at least 7,500 season ticket holders, the passionate Salford fans, of which there are hardcore, would have gone anyway. I think that was probably a really good one to test that out on. And quite a few people, I think, who didn't support either team were commenting on it on social media. So it did gather an audience. It's probably about right, because if you are a neutral, you probably would pay a fiver to watch 2 teams you don't support. It's an interesting one. I think you've got to get, as we were saying, to the idea of a digital season ticket and say, look, there's definitely going to be 1 game every week. So if you pay your 100 quid, you've got access to at least 1 extra Super League game every single week. There's maybe it's down to 23 rounds or whatever in years to come, but you divide your 100 quid by 23 and that's a really good value for money, and you just get whoever the match is. It might not be your team, it might be your team, you might be going to the game anyway, you might not, but it's an investment that you will probably make.
I agree. I think that's the way to go, but I think the RFL's ambition was to have each game available to watch live, be that on TV or through the Our League app.
I think that will happen.
To stagger your games, you have 1 game on a Thursday, 1 on a Friday. You maybe have, 2 on a Saturday and then 2 on a Sunday, and those kickoffs are staggered. So actually, if somebody really wants to, they can watch every single game out of the 6.
And I think YouTube as well. If you don't have it on Our League, I think you can have a free-to-air game on YouTube, which again you wouldn't charge for, but one of those 6 would be designated as, let's just spread the idea of Super League in a marketing manner. But I thought that was really interesting. That was brought in a bit surreptitiously at the end of the week. As you say, not heavily marketed outside of the, if you follow the RFL on Twitter, you would have seen it. But other than that, you would have had to have probably done it through word of mouth. But it could be a really significant moment this weekend. Certainly more significant than Wakefield going the entire summer era without scoring a point, so it seems. What? Sorry to mention.
What? Who? Wakefield in crisis.
The game you were at was Leeds and Wakefield this weekend. I suspect the corporate hospitality on offer was much welcome in the first half.
Yeah, I must admit, it was a boring game. It was a boring game. It's awful to say that as a Rugby League diehard, but it was hard watching the first half. The temperatures perhaps didn't help, albeit it could have been even colder than it was actually. Having said that, I actually thought Wakefield was slightly more imaginative on attack, albeit it didn't translate into points for them. And unfortunately, I think once Leeds got that first try, particularly the second try, then that was it. Then you felt the game was over at that point. But I think similarly, Thursday's game, I found that a boring game between Wigan and Catalan. And I think by and large, that's probably the conditions.
Yeah,
it's cold. It was very, very cold. It was sleeting. It was snowing, and both teams sort of play a fairly attritional game anyway. And I think with the conditions, they played it even safer. Though that's not taking anything away from Catalan and their performance, by the way. But I thought the week before with St Helens and Leeds, it was a much more entertaining game. Not necessarily the quality was there, but I thought it was entertaining. I think for me as a product, you've got to find that balance, haven't you?
But then we know at this time of year as well, those are the kind of games we get. The one thing I thought was brilliant about Catalan was that they managed to stick to that plan for 80 minutes. And it might have been restrictive in the sense that they were never going to throw the ball about if the conditions didn't suit. But to have such a young team out there and a team that the core and the spine of the team hadn't really played together before, to be so disciplined in the sense of they didn't deviate from that plan. I thought that was a massive win for them that probably deserved more credit than it actually got.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't disagree with any of that. And I think you're right. As the weeks go by and the weather gets drier, the pitches firm up, you'll see a different style of play, and it's the teams that adapt best to that, isn't it?
Although Salford would say they couldn't play any more attractively, whether it was cold, hot, summer,
True.
Winter. Again, that's part of it is your philosophy and obviously which players you've got available in those key positions. The thing about Wakefield as well, without wishing to make Richard cry more than he might have done is that when Lee Gaskill went off, I just thought that again was the opportunity of Wakefield scoring going completely out the window. Mason Leno was isolated as really the only creative player that they had, and struggled a bit in the second half. And that would be an issue for me if I was a Wakefield fan. Where is their next point going to come from? Because the longer you go not scoring, the more introverted you tend to become as a team.
And that will affect their confidence.
Yeah.
You know, I think you're absolutely right. But I think they've just got to stick patient, really, Wakefield. I think there are signs there that they've improved in terms of their performances already. But I think you're absolutely right. They need to get a point, 2 points at least on the board early in the game, just to try and sort of
get
settle
that
the nerves
particular
a little bit.
monkey off their back.
Yeah.
Who was it?
It's a record in the summer era that no team has gone 3 games without scoring a point. So you don't want that stat being put to the coach every pre-game and put to the players every post-game.
I was trying to find the tweet we had earlier where someone said, "I'll wait if you're going to go for a drop goal on." Oh, here it is. Yeah, Andrew. First question to ask is: will Wakefield go for a drop goal on their first set of 6 from the halfway line against Salford on Sunday? Oh, I mean, I'd go for that. Get it over and done with. And then when we lose 60 on 1.
Not a chance.
I think the other issue that Wakefield have got is, isn't there going to be a further pitch inspection for their game against Hull KR the following week? That again, the pitch issue is being brought up, and the Huddersfield game, it was very late on that was given the go ahead. So they need to put that to bed one way or the other, because if they can't play at home and it's got to be moved, then that's going to make it even more difficult.
It will, but I think it'll be fine. I've not cut my grass yet since the winter, but I know it needs cutting. I know that's been established far longer than we've.
Have you got a lot of sand?
But if it played the other week, I would say, well, I know we've had snow since then, but it can't have got any worse, surely. And it must have improved.
Well, we've got a new stand, though. We've got a new stand building. I've seen it. It's going to be good. We haven't got a chief executive leaving, but before we get cut off and have to rejoin, I should say, at least Michael Carter in his regime has run Wakefield like a business. On the what is thinner than a shoestring, a piece of cotton, perhaps. But the club is solvent, and we've got a new stand, and we're on the ground, and team might be rubbish at the minute, but at least we've got all those things.
Takes us into a discussion on grading, though.
Yeah, well,
then we haven't even discussed anything.
I know we can't even merge with Castleford because they've got no points either. At least we've got a head coach.
Have you had chance to look in detail at the grading criteria? Are you a fan and opponent? Do you care, in fact?
Grading, yeah. I mean, it's been a good week for Wakefield, because not only did the men not score, but the women didn't score either. So, that's... do we get any points for that?
But your new stadium will score on the grading criteria. Yeah,
but we live next door to Castleford and Featherstone and Leeds and all these other teams, so we won't get points for that. I haven't looked into it in lots of detail, only for the fact that I can't change anything, but I've got them in front of me. You get this is 25% for fandom. I'm going to read this out for people who haven't seen it. Encouraging clubs to attract more fans in stadiums, both at home and digitally. How do you be digitally in a stadium? And improve fan engagement, contributing to both club and central revenues, which I think means get more people following you on TikTok and sell more shirts. Performance, 25%. Incentivizing clubs to perform on the field and drive fan awareness and engagement. Teams will be ranked between 1 and 36 based on where they finish in the leagues for the previous 3 seasons. Bonus points to be awarded for teams who win league and cup competitions in the previous season. So that's good for if you win the 1895 Cup. Finances, 25%. And people will see again this phrase coming up, reflecting the success of fan engagement and business performance, and rewarding sustainable investment as well as diversified revenue streams and sound financial management. So there you go, there's a tick for Wakefield. 50% for stadium, based on a number of factors, including facilities and utilisation, which add value to the fan and broadcast or digital viewer experience, and match or exceed competition from other sports and events. And 10% for catchment, based on the area population and number of clubs in the area, with a view to maximising growth of the sport in the largest markets to generate new fan bases and incentivise investment. I mean, immediately, gentlemen, I'm holding up that piece of paper that Keithley brought to the meeting saying retain promotion and relegation. It's very important and everything, but That all seems like a fair framework for growing the sport. Now, whether that's the right way of going is up to people to decide, and people either like promotion and relegation or like this or like a mixture of things, but they all seem to be things which we should strive to be, don't they?
I think the talking to Carl Hall, who obviously is in charge of a club in League One, which has a degree of uncertainty about how that's going to go in the future. The one thing he said is that it puts the onus of responsibility back on the club. You're now being given a framework by which your club is judged. You're being given the tools necessary to make your club the best it can be. And that area of responsibility goes out of the governing body and just handing out money to what do you bring to the sport. I think that is a responsible way of looking at something like this. I think the other thing is, I don't know why it's taking so long. We were told, three-quarters of the way through last year that this was coming in. We were told that criteria would be announced before the end of last season, so clubs would be able to have a look at it. We've now been told what the criteria are. I would think the three of us could sit down and rank virtually every club from 1 to 36. It doesn't need a lot of investigative journalism to say a club would sit in a spot. We're being told quite rightly that there won't be enough A clubs to fill Super League, which is the ultimate aim. So you're going to have some B clubs in there. You've now got a sliding scale of rating those B clubs. To me, I don't have a problem with any of this, just the speed of which it's being implemented and the fact that it has to go back to the clubs for them to say so, when really I thought we'd employed IMG to bring this kind of thing in themselves.
Yeah, I don't know how the governance is played out. I mean, I think IMG would say it's a 12-year project. They're not in it for the short term, and I think for me it's about getting it right. And if it takes a few weeks, a few months longer, then ultimately that's what it is. I think my understanding is they're going to issue at the end of this season sort of gradings based on 2023, which will then give the opportunity for the club to have an understanding where they would fit into that structure. And then the determined grade is made in 2024 at some stage. Is that right?
Yeah. So the 2025 season is
when it starts.
If it gets passed by the clubs on the 19th of April.
Yeah, and that's the bit that I'm not sure on. Like you, why bring somebody in unless you otherwise implement what their recommendations are? But I think that's just the way that the RFL is governed, that each club has a vote, etc. But I would be highly surprised if it's not voted through. I think there was one abstention and one opposition last time.
I think there were Keithley objecting, a couple of abstentions. Yeah. That was all.
So I think there's overwhelming support there, and I think now they put a little bit more sort of flesh on the bones. None of that should really come as any surprise to people. I think that's probably what people were anticipating. I mean, with the surveyor's hat on, it looks very much like how you would, if you took a property to market and invited bids. It's how you'd set out in advance of that process, how you would analyse the offers that were going to come in, how you'd score them, etc. So then you allow the people the opportunity to bid. So it's very much the same model. The question remains: is that appropriate for sport?
It is for a sport that doesn't have enough finance and is partly full-time and partly part-time. I think, again, you look at the history of promotion and relegation within the sport of rugby league, going right back to 1895. It just promotes a boom and bust mentality, which means the sport itself can never go forward. And if we take Keithley as an example, the only way currently, I know they object to this way of doing it, but the only way currently they could get into Super League would be to probably put together a team that they can't afford to sustain. So they would need to buy players to the absolute maximum of the salary cap to get them over the line on the pitch. That's not a sustainable model with everything else that's behind them in terms of their ground capacity, their junior development, all the things that this is asking for. So I don't have an issue that, I think there's two things. One is, just because you have a grading system, it doesn't mean that promotion and relegation is gone. You can move up and down the ladder depending on how you run your business.
Absolutely.
So you're not saying it's either or.
Yeah.
But the other thing is we've got to stop dragging the game back to its lowest common denominator. So if clubs are overspending to get to the point where they're in a false position, that doesn't help them or the sport. And that's what I think this.
And there's no guarantee by
against
spending all that money that they actually would win that, because it ultimately comes down to a championship grand final, doesn't it? A £1 million game, we'll call it what you wish. And 80 minutes, anything can happen. So there's no guarantee. You can spend all that money and then suddenly you then bust because you haven't got to Super League. For me, I think it's a transparent system. People can see what targets they need to meet. And it will take clubs time to meet those targets. Clubs who are graded a C, for example, aren't going to turn it around in 12 months.
No.
But at least they can see that. And if you're an investor wanting to come in and invest in a club that's on a grade C, at least you can then see, well, these are the areas that I need to improve on. This is my current score. This is the score I need to get to a grade B license or a grade A license. And then you can target your spend accordingly. And it's not just on players' wages.
And we are short of investors and new investors. And that, again, is a blueprint that says, if you're in an expansion area or you're taking over an existing club, you know exactly where your investment is going. Now, the whole Toronto thing, when we look at it and re-examine it, you know, the amount of money that was spent on that club was phenomenal. How it was spent and whether it was spent wisely at the end and whether debts were honoured or whatever, that's a different issue to the fact that a huge amount of money was put in by an owner. 10,000 new fans were brought to the sport in a new market. But because of the way of things like promotion, relegation and other restrictions put on that club that they had to meet all the costs of the teams that were coming to play there, that investment has ultimately been completely and utterly wasted. And we're not a sport that can afford to do that. This way, I think if you wanted to take over a club that was going to score immediately on its catchment area, so you wanted to invest, let's say, in a Newcastle who might score 2 straight away on that, you need to know what you have to do in the other areas of the club to make it sustainable. As an investor coming new into the sport, I'd say that's a responsible way of looking at it. I don't have to buy my way through the divisions. I don't have to waste money in areas that I know is not going to have a return for 3 or 4 years. I can target a business plan to the objectives that are put out on that. I actually think this is a really responsible way of going about future-proofing, which is a horrible word, clubs and the sport. And we should actually be welcoming this.
Well, most clubs have. And the thing that surprises me about Keighley necessarily is not their objection to whatever they think is going to happen, but they seem to be a progressive club. They seem to be a club that are trying to do things in the community to attract different audiences, which is the kind of thing that would get you points on this system. They are trying to engage new audiences, which, as we know, have been lacking in rugby league for, well, since 1895, I guess. So they are trying to do things. They are, I guess, improving fan engagement and driving fan awareness and engagement. And they've got that promotion. They've got the off-field stuff there. So they have a chance of becoming, in the future, a club in Super League from what they're doing off the field as well as on it. And you're right, for a Keighley, to use other examples, let's say Oldham, Swinton, Rochdale, basically any team in League One, unless you've got someone who's going to come in and throw millions and millions of pounds at a squad, the dream doesn't exist. The dream is not real. It's the same in football. Blackburn Rovers won the Premier League in the mid-90s because their owner had a load of money and bought some good players. But they're now where they are. And the new money has come in and become Man City have gone from the 3rd division to a giant in the Premier League. But 20 years ago, when they didn't have that money, they weren't there. So sustainability is a good idea.
If you're coming in as an investor as well, one of the things that's going to count against you is if your investment is the sole reason why you're scoring points on finance. So what you've actually got to do is not just invest in a club that is going to do well on the field. You've got to invest in areas like, how do you deal with your fans? What is your stadium like? Now, all those other issues mean that it's not just about you bringing money. It's about how the club spends that money responsibly. So I would prefer if we were in an area of governance whereby once we'd agreed the 12-year deal with IMG, once we'd set up a board of RL commercial, that superseded the Rugby League Council for decision making. So if IMG have proposed and the Rugby League Council board agree that this is what we're doing, we implement it. Because I would have liked to have seen that we went through this whole process with unanimity. because it shows that the game is moving in the right direction. The problem again for me with Keithley's objection and how vociferous it's been and handing out an alternative paper when the criteria are released is that will always be picked up as a news story. It has to be. But the problem then is that you instead of looking at the whys and wherefores of what we're doing and why it might be responsible in moving the game forward, we've always got division. I'm not sure we need division at this time when we're going to market to negotiate with a television broadcaster.
And we're looking forward to the wider rebrand of the men's and women's Super League competitions later this year ahead of the 2024 season launch by IMG sister company and cultural marketing agency. I don't know what that means. 160/90 cultural marketing. I didn't do that in A-level business studies in the late 90s. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. It's all very interesting. It's all.
One of the challenges, though, licensing system that we had before, talking on the field here, was that you ended up with too many games towards the end of the season that were meaningless. So I'm not sure what does this system do to counteract that? Because
it won't
your on-field performance only counts for a small, what is it, 20-25% of your overall score.
The corollary of that it gives you a chance to build clubs so that as and when we get more A-grade clubs, they are it doesn't do the NRL any harm that clubs from year to year can change their position on the league table because there isn't relegation behind them. I would cite Catalan as the perfect example of that they were absolved from relegation for the first 3 years. They would have gone down initially before they even had a chance to build a club, to taste the atmosphere of Super League. But look at them now, 15, 16, 17 years on, they've won a Challenge Cup, they've been in a grand final, they hold the record for the highest attendance of a Super League game. That they were able to build their business initially that now makes it sustainable further down the line. And looking at their performance on Thursday night, and particularly all 4 games they've played this year when they of all clubs had more players playing in the World Cup than anybody else. I think what they've got now with more young French players coming through is something that is going to stand them in good stead, that every time we sit and do our predictions at the beginning of the season, we've got them more at the top end than the bottom end. I think it was almost criminal what happened to Toulouse last year, that they were almost in that same boat, that we've got a city in France that is a rugby city that's one of the 4th biggest in France. It's got some huge industries there. They've got a ground which you'll have refereed at that is a great facility, but we'll never know how good they would have been because of promotion relegation meant that business almost went to the wall because they were relegated. But they were always going to be relegated in their first year. That's when they were going to be vulnerable, and they wanted to play those players that have got them out of the championship to at least give them the opportunity. I think that's what we've got to stop. And that on the field, there will always be meaningless games. There'll always, there's been a 60-0 already this year. You can't control that. The salary cap is evenly spread in the NFL, but there are still some blowout scores in matches. I don't think
it should be about eliminating blowout scores because you'll have that. I think what you want is uncertainty of result.
Absolutely.
And I think you saw that at the weekend, didn't you? Because how many people would have predicted that Lee would have beat St. Helens?
Exactly.
And I think the more games you get where you've got uncertainty of outcome, the more people will be engaged with the sport. And hopefully that will be a byproduct of the grading system.
I think you get in there if you do that, because as I said, there's always a league. The NFL is a classic example. Everybody spends maximum salary cap. They have a draft to make sure that the college players go to the least ranked team. You would think that would be a competition whereby you wouldn't be able to predict any result any week. But what is it? Of the 18 rounds, after 12, there's already teams that can't qualify for the playoffs. So that's where it does come down to how you manage your roster, how good your coach is. I think we'll get to that with a system like this, but with promotion relegation, there's too much looking over your shoulder, unsustainable business models. Stick with this, have a slight expansion element with your catchment area so that there is an encouragement to say to areas like Cornwall or France. I mean, I think this is geared up to the French team as much as anyone, London particularly. There's an extra incentive for you that other clubs who are traditionally based won't have. And actually, the new clubs that come in will be sustainable and competitive sooner rather than later. And I think if that's what we get, then your right concern about games that don't matter will actually be less relevant.
I mean, if it gives clubs a kick up the backside to try and find new supporters, I mean, Wakefield, an example there. Michael Carter for years has banged on about wanting, was it 6,500 to spend a full salary cap? Salford have been to 2 cup finals in recent years, and their crowds are, I don't know if they're stagnant or not, but they're not growing by thousands, are they? You know,
no.
Lee.
Also, I thought it was a really telling comment by Troy Grant, who obviously the head of the IRL, who when he saw some of the social media debate about whether grading was a good or a bad thing, actually said, the Heartlands were not as supportive as the World Cup as perhaps he would have hoped. Now, again, there's a bigger debate about ticketing prices and where the matches were staged and all that. But it's interesting that somebody who doesn't come from our competition and viewed it from the outside said that, yes, there is an element of you have to support what we've already got, but let's not lose sight of the fact that purely those areas are not going to sustain the game on their own, which is just, I thought was a very interesting comment.
It is, but I think international sport allows a greater cut through, doesn't it? If you live in London, you never watched Rugby League before, but you've got an interest in following an England team, you're more likely to go and watch it. If it's a London Broncos team, for example, or another London team, then you may be slightly less inclined. I appreciate it's still London, but I think that's the beauty of international sport, and that's unfortunate why the game as a whole can't all buy into it.
Which is great that we're taking the next England internationals to that great non-Heartlands place of Warrington. But there you go. We should praise Lee a bit more, and I want to give them praise in terms of my point after the first game was, right, you've done all this stuff for game 1. What are you doing for game 2? What are you doing for game 3? They are doing things for each game, which, whether sustainable or not, at least they were giving it a go. And they've got the results on the pitch now as well, especially that win over St Helens on Friday. As much as we can all have opinions about Lee and the way things sometimes are run at the club, they've started well, started better than many expected, and certainly put pressure on 2 teams who haven't got any points below them in the table. And St Helens as well, of course, were rubbish because they've only won 1 game.
I think you're right that what we need to do is praise them for what we can see. I personally would think that I know all of this is being financed by Derek Beaumont. I also know that probably what I would be advising him to do, particularly again looking at how the game may unfold going forward, is that somebody should be talking to him about his use of social media. I don't think that does necessarily engage new fans. And in terms of what he's about to put out, and we've obviously seen with the whole Gary Lineker case, you freedom to put out what you think is appropriate. I just think as an owner of a club, it wouldn't do him any harm to have that kind of a buffer where he thinks he's about to tweet. He's got somebody he can send it to that says, actually, that's probably not the thing that the owner of a club should be saying at the moment. There are lots of good things you could be saying. There's lots of things you could be reveling in that you're responsible for at the moment. But some of the things that he says and the manner in which he goes about his business, I'm not sure is in the best interest of the sport. That said, the players he's bought, not he's bought, but obviously he's put the money up to make sure that the coach gets the kind of squad that he wants. The fact that they have really bought into this, we need to make the game day an experience. All of that is to be praised. The fact that they came from behind to beat St Helens, I think says a hell of a lot about the durability of that team. And as you say, if you put points on the board early in the season, puts enormous pressure. It may well be that they are still involved in a scrap at the bottom at the end of the year. But if you've already got 4 points on the board, there's an element of freedom that you can play with in the knowledge that they haven't got this kind of pressure on them that Wakefield and Castleford have already, a month in. So, yeah, let's praise them for what they're doing. But I just would request of him, and it's nothing to do with me, that he's just a little bit more conservative in what he puts out there and the manner in which he puts it out.
Social media, James. That's been great for the match officials, hasn't it? Because never has it been easier just to, midway through a game, players slag off your decisions or whatever. You must really praise those who invented the ability to send a message within seconds of you getting something obviously completely and utterly wrong, because everything you do is wrong, or did was wrong. Now you're perfect, but everything you did on the pitch was wrong.
There's a reason why I came off Twitter about 12, 13 years ago.
Because you're more intelligent than the rest of us.
I was just inundated with abuse, so I just decided to not, inflict that upon myself. But most of the other referees are on it, and fair play to them. But I didn't want to open myself up to that, albeit I did get some via other social media. But I think Twitter in particular invites that sort of comment. I think there were too many examples for me last year where active players were being critical of match officials on Twitter. And that for me is unacceptable, brings the game into disrepute, and should be sanctioned by the RFL. I'm not sure how many of those cases were. I know some were, but not necessarily every one of them. And not to say that people can't have an opinion, but I think the way it's done is not great. Having said that, I think there's a place for the match officials department to speak a little bit more publicly about decisions. The fact that we've seen 3 8-point tries in 2 weeks or thereabouts, that is a talking point, and you do have to ask, well, why is that? Has there been a challenge to interpretation? And I think they would sort of say, well, we're having those discussions with the clubs, but I think the wider game probably should know that. Now, whether that's being fed through media, I don't know, but I think there should be a role for perhaps a bit better communication, so people feel that referees are never heard from, and they're not interviewed post-match. And I get that, but we implemented it was a few years ago now, ask the ref on Twitter, and it didn't work that well. It worked probably quite well initially, but you got somebody that sort of asked a legitimate question. You put your hand up and said, yes, we got it wrong, and then you got shot down for saying, well, you got it wrong, you should have got it right. Well, so you couldn't win in some respect. And other questions where you said, no, the decision was correct, and you explained why it was correct, they still thought you were wrong anyway. So it just didn't really work as a method. So I think there probably are ways. You're never going to convince somebody black is white and vice versa. But I think if you can set out perhaps some reasons why decisions have been given or not given. So, for example, the Walters incident the other week, that in my opinion was a mistake by the referee. It wasn't. He made a live judgment, which from his position was difficult to see whether it was a shoulder charge or not. The angles we saw were all completely different angles that showed it much more clearly. The video referee didn't give input on that occasion because he didn't feel it merited a sin bin. And so the referee and the touch judges were left to their live view of the incident. And ultimately, in my opinion, they made an error of judgment. Now, people probably don't realise that I suspect that was the conclusion out of that. Whereas, so then people are left a little bit confused of, what is that a shoulder charge or not? Do you have to rotate, for example? I think it's just providing that clarity to people. That's not to say mistakes will happen in the future, because you have to make decisions in live play.
They've got to be perfect. We need to get AI robot referees who make no incorrect decisions, because obviously everyone on a rugby league pitch and in the stands is perfect. I mean, I know, Phil, you never make any mistakes in your match reports. You never make any spelling errors or anything, or give players the wrong mark out of 10.
All the time. It's a game of opinion. And the thing is, that's what we thrive on that. So we shouldn't shy away from that. It's also, a game of decisions. And, as you just said, in life, you're going to make some wrong ones. But I don't think we need to apologise for that. I think we do need to explain it. And that's the thing. The other thing we've always said why we wouldn't criticise a match official is there's no one incident that ever determines a game. The later it comes in the game, the more people think it's determined the game. But clubs have 79.5 minutes to determine their own fate. So it's not like football where games are going to end 1-0 and that 1-0 could be a penalty, and that penalty decision is the wrong decision and all the focus is on that. We have 79.5 minutes of the club's deciding how that game is going to go, whether they're disciplined, indisciplined, standing offside, forward passing, knocking the ball on, missing a tackle. So focusing all the time on one thing that a referee may or may not have got wrong, you've got to get away from saying that was the reason why a team won or lost. It rarely, if ever, is.
But the reality is that's never going to change. That's never going to change, because it's easy to point the finger at a decision.
And we live in a blame culture.
Yeah, I'm not. That's not going to change. Look, for me, it's about communicating if that decision was perceived to be wrong, just to provide clarity going forward. I listened to Willie Peters talking about the game this weekend. He was he sort of said he would be seeking clarification basically around how the ruck was refereed in the application of 6 agains. Now that's slightly different, because that's not a one-off decision. That's an interpretation. I suspect it was because they only received one set restart. Now, I don't know how many set restarts, it was Warrington they played, wasn't it? I don't know how many set restarts they received, but what you often find is that there'll be an imbalance in that number. And so that, there's sometimes a pressure on referees to demonstrate balance. Now, balance doesn't mean that the numbers should be equal, not at all.
Well, possession's going to determine that.
Absolutely, but ultimately you should just referee what's in front of you. And if the set restart or the penalty count ends up lopsided, then that should reflect what's happened on the field. And you shouldn't be artificially massaging numbers just to show balance. That's not what balance is about. But it's about consistency. 4-1 in terms of set restarts. Well, when you've only given 5 in a game, it's very easy to point at an imbalance, because it's not a massive number. So what do you want it to be? 3-2, and suddenly you've got balance. So I think it's a bigger picture than that. The ruck is obviously a tricky area of the game to officiate, and it's probably tricky to have 100% consistency from game to game. That is a tricky area. It's one-off decisions that are perhaps easier to explain and provide clarity on.
Is 6 again an advantage, or has that placed an impossible onus on referees with it? We want the game to be quicker, but also we're looking for reasons why an interpretation is slowing that game down. And to a fan, interpretation is never good, because we think it's the referee showing a favouritism, rather than there's a rule or a law. It's been broken. It's a high tackle. It's a shoulder charge, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I've seen a bit of criticism recently about set restarts. For me, I think they work well. It does give greater flow to the game, but I think sometimes when you're at a game live, you may not understand why it's being given. When you watch it probably on the TV, you probably have a better view of that individual ruck. But in the old days, when a penalty was given for hand on the ball, did you have any more idea that a penalty was given for hand on the ball than a set restart being given? You'd argue, well, the referee gave a signal, so you'd look at the signal for what that particular ruck offence was. Was it a leg pull? Was it a hand on ball, for example? You'd see a signal. Yeah, that perhaps provides some clarity. But I think overall, the set restart system works. You would still have coaches saying there's an inconsistency in the application of penalties for ruck interference, whether that was a penalty or a set restart. So I don't think it's changed.
I think it's about slowing down the ruck, that certain teams are perceived to hold on to the absolute maximum and don't get penalised for a set or don't get a penalty against them, whereas other teams that are seen to be playing the ball quickly, then their fans start getting upset at the fact that they're being prevented from doing that. I think having acting halfbacks who are constantly waving their arm around doesn't help.
Well, in terms of referees' review, each game is statted independently by Opta, or Perform, I think they're now called. They stat the games in terms of ruck speeds. They stat the 10 metres, so the referee's scored in terms of his own review on his accuracy of setting his 10 metres, and is scored in terms of the speed of the ruck. And you'll be able to see whether there is an imbalance in speed between one team or another. That may not be attributable necessarily to the referee. That ruck timing is split between initial contact and the tackle being completed. That's phase 1. And then phase 2 is once the tackle's called as being completed to the ball being played. So that's phase 2. Phase 2 is something that the referee probably controls a little bit more, because he calls when the tackle's completed. and then the ball's played. The first phase, initial contact to the move call, is trickier, because if you get a game that's more upright tackles, then you're going to have slower rucks, because players will probably be held upright initially for a split second before being put on the ground. And some coaches will still talk about trying to prevent this upright tackling, but every change has a knock-on effect. So if you try and prevent the upright tackles, you potentially limit the offloads, and the offloads for me create a different dynamic to the game, take away a little bit of structure, and players then start playing a little bit more off the cuff. So for every change you make, it has a knock-on effect, and for some coaches it suits their style and their playing squad, and for others it doesn't. So the game as a whole, when they make changes like that, have to think about what's best, in the best interest for the game overall. And I would say set restarts work well as they do.
You see, you talk about explanation. There you have it. I shall never complain about a 6 again.
I'm sure you will.
No, but I understand now the theory behind it, which I'm not sure has been explained. You can put it down as this is how we're going to administer it. But when you talk about it in practice on the field, suddenly it makes a hell of a lot more sense.
I think one of the main reasons it was introduced was you saw certain teams, particularly on the defensive line, on the goal line, willing to just concede a penalty because that allowed them to reset their line. Whereas actually a set restart doesn't allow you to do that. You're still against a scrambling defence, and suddenly you've gone from tackle 4 to tackle 0, and you've got to defend that set. And that's really the main reason why it was brought in, to stop those teams from deliberately slowing the game down, resetting the line. And I think that's worked.
I also think what's worked is giving more penalties at scrums for offside that are no longer differential penalties, because teams were standing up offside to stop scrum moves. And I think we've seen more penalties this year.
But I don't know whether that's true. You may have seen proportionally more penalties, but I think that's because more teams have decided to trap the ball in the second row. Now, they would argue it's to bring the scrum half round to allow that attacking opportunity, and I've seen that on a few occasions, and it's worked effectively. There was a scrum try in the Huddersfield game. It wasn't perhaps in that situation. There were 2 in the Hull Cast game in round 1 when I was there. So that's working perhaps a little bit more. And the change of the law where teams were allowed to bring the scrum to the centre field has allowed that opportunity to open up. But, for me, I think it's partly to do with the players and less to do with the referees. I don't think the referees are applying the offside law on scrums any differently to than when they did last year. It's just that the way that teams are playing now is different. And more teams are being caught out perhaps early on with going a little bit early on the scrum. I think as they get used to that, they'll probably be a little bit more disciplined to hold that line.
James is the youngest person here. Phil, do you remember when they actually put the ball in the scrum in the middle?
I remember hookers being sent off. For technical offences, it was called. I've no idea. Dark arts.
Well, we definitely don't want to go to those days, do we? We don't want scrums that last five minutes.
Or 17 a game, which we had at one stage. We used to think that was entertainment.
If we want to do that, we can watch something else. But well done to all the teams who won in the Challenge Cup, because we're running out of time. Especially Halifax, who probably caused the upset of the round. Sadly,
upset or a shock. I heard that on a radio station this morning. I don't think it's a shock when a team at the top of the championship beats another team at the top of the championship. It's a great result for Halifax, absolutely no question. But I wouldn't have said that was a shock.
Well, compared to everything else in the cup this week, it probably was, because there was nothing else happened. The big disappointment is that Hunslet lost to Keighley, so we can't get Hunslet versus Hunslet in the next round. And if community clubs aren't amateur clubs, why aren't Hunslet CRL FL and Hunslet? Anyway, that's just semantics. I'm getting dragged off onto a tangent. Well done to Saints, who will bounce back from their awful form to beat Hull this week, though. So congratulations to them on the telly. I think that's Friday night, isn't it? So that'll be good.
Yeah. Castle Leeds on Friday night.
And proof again yesterday that I was right all along. Wakefield, Castlewood and Featherstone should merge their women's teams, but say about that. Anything else?
And the season has been launched, so
that's this week. Yeah, so that's exciting. Leeds got their squad numbers yesterday, I saw. So
first time names will be on the back of the shirts, which again is moving into that realm of we want recognisable people that we can tell stories about. So let's hope that all the wheelchair teams start to do that soon.
Tom Halliwell on Strictly Come Dancing and MasterChef and Love Island and everything. We're not taking him away from playing, so we can't do that. James, thank you very much for your time this evening. Are you going to come back on? Are you going to come back in?
Yeah, I'd like to think so. Yeah,
I think he may have passed the audition.
So I'll save all the questions about. So, which players don't you like for when we're off the air next time and when I'm in the studio? Phil, the new magazine is out this week.
Yeah, a few talking points in it as well. We look at the trans issue in rugby league, whether that ban is fair or not, and a big piece about is it inevitable that rugby league and rugby union will at some point come so close together that there's only one sport called rugby.
What's Mascot banging on about this rugby 11s going on in Japan? What's that all about? No idea. Has he just made it up? Is it a made up thing?
I think he's got the rights to something, but I've no idea what it is.
I've got the rights to a made up team in North Korea, but I don't know. James, enjoy your retirement. It looks like you are, which is good. You're not going to do a Rob Hicks and come back, are you? You'll just pretend to retire.
Oh, you never know. You never know, do you?
Right, the Frank Sinatra of rugby league, apart from without the mafia connections, allegedly. Right, how do I get out of this? James, thank you. Phil, thank you. Buy the magazine. I'm off to hide.